Welcome to the first webinar of 2025. I'm really happy to see all of you here today, and I'm really excited about this particular topic. It's something I have been thinking a lot about in recent months, and I think it's become particularly important as we have moved into 2025 and seen the way that this year is already shaping up. For those of you who have been paying attention to what is happening in the United States as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, this week has been a really tough week. And I know specifically some of you who are here do work in the DEI space. You work in conflict management, dispute resolution, and you work in leadership roles. And so a lot of what we're experiencing this week is really impacting you in particular. So I just want to invite us to take a moment and settle in and just give our nervous systems a little rest. Take a few deep breaths, maybe breathing in a little. Feel yourself grounded to the earth. Feel yourself connected to those places that give you joy. And exhale any stress that might be coming into this space with you today. So we'll just take one or two more deep breaths. Inhale and exhale. And one more inhale, kind of breathing in the community that is here today to support this work and be in relationship with one another. So thank you for being here. My name is Robin Short, and I am the founder and CEO at Workplace Peace Institute. I like to offer the disciplines that inform my work so that people understand how I think about the content that we're discussing today and the ways that I'm kind of thinking about how it relates to our roles as leaders. So I work as an organization systems design consultant. What that means is that I'm really interested in understanding how the system, the organization, the policies, the practice, the belief systems are informing the way the humans are showing up in those spaces. I work as a leadership development trainer and coach, supporting leaders in building skills and competencies to be more compassionate leaders who feel the courage and competency to lead with dignity. I do work in conflict management, dispute resolution, and I think about that work really as peace building work, supporting people in the skills necessary to optimize human security and dignity in the workplace. I think we can't do this work without being very intentional and informed and knowledgeable about diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So I support organizations in those efforts. And my hope is that all of this is helping the individuals within all of our organizations really achieve their human potential in the workplace. This webinar and all of our monthly webinars are part of the Workplace Peace Institute Leadership Academy. All of our Academy courses are designed to support our competencies in human behavior. So this includes building skills in being better communicators, being better conflict engagers, and to have a lot of skill in cultivating workplaces that are diverse, that are equitable, that are inclusive, and ultimately where everyone experiences a high degree of belonging so that our basic human needs are met, dignity is consistently honored, and we thrive in the workplace. So today's webinar is one little tiny piece of how we hope to do this work. So what we're going to learn about today is understanding a little bit about civility and the paradox of civility in our workplaces, to be able to be thinking about exclusionary practices and how civility can actually unintentionally lead to exclusionary practices, and hopefully explore some balanced approaches of being in right relationship with one another in the workplace. So I want to come into this today with an honest disclaimer. Um, this webinar is really a result of the visceral response that I had in late 2024 to SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Management's push toward civility in the workplace. I immediately saw all the ways that prioritizing civility could lead to oppressive workplaces. And I started getting requests from various different SHRM chapters to come speak about civility in the workplace. And I would kind of laugh to myself thinking, I'm not sure I'm the person you want to have coming and delivering this message, because there has to be a lot of conditions in place in order for civility to actually support the human condition. And we're going to explore those. So we are having this conversation today specifically because of the ways that I'm seeing how a shift away from DEI as a discipline, with a focus on just inclusion and diversity while prioritizing civility, how that can lead us to workplaces that ultimately do a lot of harm. And you have to be really skilled in the work of equity in order for civility to be a positive add-on. If we remove equity from the equation and we prioritize civility, we will be creating a workplace culture where people from historically marginalized communities will likely not experience belonging and where real harm could be done. And so we're going to dig into that today. So I want to start, as I was thinking about, and I need to minimize my screen for just a minute, as I was thinking about how to talk about this today, I think it's helpful for us, because this webinar is really coming as a response to SHRM's movement away from equity and towards civility. I think it's helpful for us to contextualize the way SHRM thinks about inclusion and where I think there are some shortcomings in the way that SHRM is presenting inclusion and diversity, so that we can better understand what is really going to be necessary, particularly in a landscape where DEI is being defunded across the nation. So when SHRM talks about inclusion, the definitions around inclusion that they offer is that it's an environment in which everyone feels valued, respected, and has equal access to opportunities. There's a really specific definition of respect that we work with at Workplace Peace Institute that goes far beyond being kind and professional. When I think about the body of work that SHRM does as it relates to inclusion, I think the definition of respect is really more aligned with being professional and civil in our relationships with one another. So inclusion is where people feel valued, respected, and they have equal access to opportunities so that they can fully contribute to the organization's success, regardless of what differences they may have. So there's a focus on individual inclusion in which everyone feels, which is how people feel within the organization. They acknowledge that active effort is required. So to create an inclusive environment, we need to have some intentional actions and policies to ensure everyone feels valued. And it benefits the organization because it leads to increased employee engagement, creativity, and overall performance. The word that continuously stands out for me in the definition that SHRM operates with around inclusion is the word feels, that people feel. And the wording around all of this really matters because the language that we use tells us a lot about where power is situated in a relationship. So in the way that SHRM talks about inclusion, it's designed so that everyone feels a certain way. They feel valued and they feel respected, which means that the onus is on this person and how they're actually feeling. The power dynamic is not necessarily on the organization to ensure that this is actually the case. So there's a shift from inclusion is when people are valued, people are respected. That's putting power to ensure that that's taking place on the organization. But when it's languaged in how we feel, then you will begin to hear, well, I can't be responsible for the way you're feeling. This is a place where respectful language is happening, or whatever. It's about where power sits. So the definition that I work with at Workplace Peace Institute around inclusion is similar, but the power structure is slightly different. So inclusion is an organizational effort and practices in which different groups or individuals having different backgrounds are culturally and socially accepted, welcomed, and equally treated. So that means that there's intentionality around placing policies, putting practices in place, ensuring that training is pervasive so that people have the skills to actualize this. So the power structure is on the organization to ensure people are in fact included. And these people are coming from a whole diverse set of identities, thinking, and abilities. So I'm putting this in this position, inclusion and diversity, because SHRM very intentionally, and there was a great deal of controversy around this, shifted from a discipline of diversity, equity, and inclusion to saying, we're going to focus on inclusion. And it's so important that I really land this. What they're saying is, we're really going to focus on how you feel, not the structural reality of what has to be in place for inclusion to take place. So diversity, as defined by SHRM, is the collective mixture of differences and similarities that includes individual and organizational characteristics, values, beliefs, experiences, backgrounds, preferences, and behaviors. So this means diversity is encompassing not just the visible traits like race and gender, but also invisible aspects like socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, learning styles, and a whole host of disabilities that are not always visible. It's broad in scope, and there is a focus on inclusion. So we're going to see this language again. While diversity refers to the mixes of differences, SHRM emphasizes the importance of creating an inclusive environment. So we want to have diversity where everyone feels valued. It's continuing to put the power structure on the individual with responsibility around how they feel. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about how that can actually cause a lot of harm. I don't think that I said this in my disclaimer, and I want to be able to say this explicitly now. This is a call out on SHRM as a means of hopefully calling in all SHRM practitioners to really deepen their practice in equity, to really deepen their practice in fairness, and to hopefully be voices in the organization to create positive change. Okay, so when I think about diversity, the way that we work with that as a discipline here at Workplace Peace Institute is that it's any dimension that can be used to differentiate groups and people from one another. It's about empowering people through respect and appreciating what makes them different. I think the word empower is really critical because empower is honoring the inherent power that lives within you. Every individual has personal power, but we will have access to our power based off what the system we're operating in. Does that system ensure that there is safety for me to step into my power, or is that system suppressing my power? So when we are working in the work of equity, we want to be sure that we are actually designing a system where people have unfettered access to their personal power. Diversity allows for the exploration of these differences in safe, positive, and nurturing environment. So we are able to really live in the fullness of our personal power without any fear that there's going to be retribution for doing that, that it supports us in being able to contribute positively to the organization, and it feels like it is a nourishing space to be in. So I want to really dig into the language of what we mean by respect, because respect goes so much more than being polite in being kind and being professional in our communication. Respect is something that is earned, and we earn that by honoring people's dignity. And there is a very specific framework for doing that. Those of you who have been in any one of my sessions at any point ever, if you have engaged with Workplace Peace Institute, you have very likely seen this framework of basic human needs and dignity needs. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but it's important that we spend a little bit of time here so that we understand what it means to be respectful, and that there's a structure that needs to be in place for respect to be earned. So this framework is informed by the work of John Burton and Donna Hicks. John Burton was a conflict resolution scholar who was very predominant in the 60s and 70s, and he did a lot of work around basic human needs. Dr. Donna Hicks was a student of his, and when she went on to do her conflict resolution work in the field, what she found was at the core of every conflict was a violation of what she began to think of as dignity. And the way she talks about dignity is that it is our inherent worth and belonging as human beings. As humans, we have dignity. As humans, we have worth and value. But we are particularly vulnerable to having that worth and value violated. So she identifies some 10 essential ways that we are vulnerable to having our dignity violated. And they are acceptance of identity, inclusion, acknowledgement, recognition, fairness, having the benefit of the doubt extended to us, having understanding extended to us, being able to act independently and autonomously on our own behalf, and to be held accountable to our choices. I have found that there is a correlation between our capacity to experience our basic human needs and how effectively we are experiencing our worth and value as humans. So in the research that I've conducted, what I have found is that when people's essential elements of dignity are very consistently honored, they are also experiencing love and self-esteem and personal fulfillment and justice and physical and psychological safety and security and belonging and cultural security and participation. So there's a relationship between these things that really matter. When we think about the word respect, it's earned through the honoring of every single one of these things. So I am in respectful relationship with someone when that person is being intentional about honoring my dignity needs and my basic human needs. So you can see that this goes so much deeper than just being nice to somebody, just being polite to a person. And you can see that what is necessary for me as a person to experience any one of these dignity elements and any one of these basic human needs is going to be different than the next person. So in order for me to truly honor a person's dignity and to truly ensure that their basic human needs are met, I have to, as a leader, ensure that I am eliminating the barriers that are preventing that from happening. So you can't honor dignity needs and basic human needs inside of a system without prioritizing equity. So we'll take a look at what equity means. So SHRM is no longer focusing on equity. What they named when they pulled equity from their specific definition of the work that they were doing and said, we're going to focus on inclusion and diversity. And in doing so, equity will be the natural consequence of that. The way that they designed, I mean, the way that they did formally define equity is that it means ensuring fair treatment. It means ensuring access and opportunity for advancement for all individuals, and that it aims at leveling the playing field by recognizing that people may have different starting points and need tailored support to achieve equal outcomes. So there's a focus on fairness and there's a focus on addressing systemic barriers. So what that acknowledges is that we do not all come into our work environments on an equal or same playing field to access each of these basic human needs and dignity needs. Therefore, the work of equity is to ensure that there is a structure in place that does make it fair, that everyone is able to access those dignity needs and basic human needs, and that the systems that have prevented that from being a lived reality are addressed. So we're seeing this through a systemic perspective. The definition of equity that we work with at Workplace Peace Institute is really similar to the way that SHRM used to define equity, and it's essentially is that this is a fair place to be. That in an equitable society, all people have full and unbiased access to livelihood, education, and participation in the spaces in which we're living and working. So politically, culturally, and there's fairness in terms of accessing all social benefits. So you have to look at systemic barriers to ensure that this is actually in place. I'm going to present this slide to you because I think it's a slide many of us have seen before. We have seen before this idea that equality is everyone is treated the same. So there is a fence and we all have a box, and you can see how equality doesn't always lead to fairness. And then in this same thinking, equity is that we are given the resources that we need to have an equal experience. So the outcome is that we can all see over the fence, and we all need some resources to support us in seeing over the fence. I would say, and I think that I'm presenting this because I think this is what most of us have seen before. What I would really say is that applying resources to be able to see over the fence is the work of justice. Equity is we have actually eliminated the barrier that makes these additional things necessary. So the fence is no longer there, and I don't need additional resources in order to have the same experience. So when we think about equity through that perspective, we are through the work of justice, we are eliminating the barriers that are creating unequal experiences. It isn't possible to achieve that through civility. You have to have equity as the priority. By having equity as the priority, we will be able to create more diverse spaces that lead to inclusive experiences, where then applying civility is the cherry on top. And civility naturally happens because we are living in a fair and equitable workplace. So as SHRM went into the process of deprioritizing equity, I want to be clear here. They did not say we are no longer doing DEI. They said we're going to do I and D, period. And then they launched a campaign around civility. And since then, they've really stopped talking about I and D. It was sort of like they were sort of closing out a chapter. And now there's this big push for civility. There's a whole handbook that you can download that prioritizes civility. So the way that they define civility is that at its core, it's about treating people with respect and kindness, even in challenging situations. Civility goes beyond the simple politeness of refraining from personal attacks or disrespectful behavior. It involves active listening and acknowledging diverse perspectives so that others feel fully heard. So civility is moving us back into, let's be nice to one another, and then we're going to put the focus back on that person managing their own responsibility about the way something's making them feel. By modeling these behaviors, you can set standards for everyone else to follow and even increase your standing within the organization as you develop a reputation for consensus building among your fellow leaders. So this is how SHRM is talking about civility. So rather than focusing on fair treatment, rather than focusing on equitable access, rather than focusing on the elimination of systemic barriers, all of these things as they relate to how people are able to access opportunities for advancement, we're going to focus on being kind to one another and ensuring that people feel heard. So being kind to people and ensuring people feel heard is always happening within culture. And so who gets to define what is kind? And what if people don't feel heard? What do we do then? So I want to look at how this focus on kindness and politeness without focusing on the elimination of systemic barriers can ultimately, and I have to assume unconsciously, lead to increased oppression in the workplace. So the minute I saw this movement happen, the very first announcement that I heard about this, my first thought was, oh my gosh, this is going to lead to more oppression. And so I thought, well, I'm just going to Google that and see what comes up. And this quote from Rory Bahadur surfaced immediately, and in a much more eloquent way, really articulated what I was feeling in my body. Civility as an offshoot of moral philosophy functions as a formidable instrument of oppression, epitomizing the behavioral norms and ideological constructs imposed by the powerful upon the powerless to sustain entrenched hierarchical structures within society, thereby obfuscating the pervasive inequities that undergird the social fabric. So civility has this intense focus on being polite. And being polite is a core tenet of our dominant culture. And there is usually a pretty strong backlash to people behaving impolitely. And this is exactly why civility can lead to oppression. So when we think about, so before we move into this cultural piece, I want to just talk very briefly about power structures. And then I'm gonna make a connection to why I'm bringing this up. So these definitions around power come from the Right Use of Power Institute, and the way that they talk about power is that all human beings have power. Like dignity, it is a birthright. You come into this world a powerful human being, accompanied by the inherent human right to be treated with dignity, respect, and fairness. Always present. Our personal power is always present, but we can be more or less aware of it and can have more or less access to it, depending on what our identities are and the cultures that we're moving in. Our personal power can be limited by ourselves, others, and culture, but in most situations, we can retain some personal power through self-regulation, self-respect, and frame of mind. Personal power comes in many forms, including awareness of communication, our presence, our creativity. So we all have personal power. And then there is a type of power called role power. And this is the type of power that the systems that we're operating in, and for the purposes of our learning today, I'm going to call this system dominant culture. So in the dominant culture, this Western dominant culture that we're all operating in, this system has assigned a certain value to different roles in our system. So these roles can be earned through our education. I would say can be earned through the lens of meritocracy. It can be awarded to us. We have role power through elections, and it can also be assigned to us. It automatically accompanies any position of authority, and it's separate from, but an added layer to personal power. So you have personal power, and then this role power is either earned, awarded, elected, or assigned to you. Different roles carry different levels of power. And some examples would be a supervisor, manager, executive leadership, political leaders. Inside of our dominant culture, we assign a lot of role power to people with significant wealth. And then we have a type of power called status power. And this is the type of power that's culturally conferred. So in our dominant culture, I would say the status power that holds the most status would be a white, cisgendered, fully abled man of some degree of wealth and physical stature in terms of robust mental health and robust physical health. So status power often goes unrecognized by the people who hold it. Since we each have multiple social locations, our status power and combinations are all unique. If you have ever seen the wheel of power and privilege, that's what that wheel of power and privilege is looking to articulate. And it depends on cultural values and may change from culture to culture. So examples include race, age, ability, gender, and socioeconomic status. If you are a person who holds high status power, you also very likely hold high role power, because that's the system has ensured that that status power is moving you up in role power. Because you have status power, you are likely to be less aware of, less attuned to, less familiar with your personal power, and therefore can experience feelings of fragility when you are with people who hold less status power, but are in strong and right relationship with their personal power. So I'm naming this because it has a really critical role in how culture operates and how civility can become abusive. So when we think about dominant culture norms, this dominant cultural norms information is coming from the work of Tina Occam. And the way Tina Occam talks about this is through the lens of white supremacy culture. I sometimes talk about this as white culture. As we are living in and working in a landscape where equity work is being defunded, being deprioritized, and I would say in many capacities becoming dangerous. I'm playing around with how I name this because it's important that people are able to hear it. And certain words hit our nervous system in different ways. So I'm talking about it through the lens of dominant culture norms, but I want to be clear that dominant culture norms are the norms associated with status power. And in the United States and in Western cultures, these are norms that benefit and support white identifying human beings, and that also support in increased ways people who hold a lot of status power. So that's also going to be masculine identifying people. So these norms that really shape the way we're in relationship with each other, and that really shape the way we are in professional relationship with each other, has a big impact on what civility ultimately looks like. So sometimes when I present this information to people, people will say, well, this is just what professional norms look like. And my question is, well, let's explore where these professional norms come from. And they come from dominant culture. So in dominant culture norms, and this should probably feel familiar to most of you, there is usually a sense of urgency. And the way that that shows up is that we're putting our work before our relationship. We are putting results before process, meaning we're not trusting process. We're not being intentional about designing process. We're always focusing on results first. We're putting outcomes as a priority before truly inclusive spaces where people are welcomed, where people are heard, where people are respected versus how they feel. We don't create space for there to be mistakes. And we can't learn from our mistakes. So there's a lot of shame that can surface when mistakes happen. And quantity is prioritized over quality. So when we look at this through the lens of urgency, it is difficult for people of all identities to experience respect and kindness when these values are perhaps being lorded over you because of the hierarchy and the power structure. And if we're putting an emphasis on how we feel as what inclusion looks like, well, you might not feel very good about this at all. But if you know that civility is what we're prioritizing, how much of my own personal power am I going to be able to step into to name this without bucking the system in a way that's going to harm me? In dominant cultural norms, we also have a conflict avoidance. So people who hold more status power and more role power can be defensive when ideas they don't agree with are presented to them. There might be difficulty in hearing new ideas. They're perceived as an actual threat to the person's identity. We protect certain people's feelings. So this is a really critical thing when we think about what civility in the workplace looks like. Whose feelings are we protecting? Well, in dominant culture norms, we're protecting the feelings of the people who hold the most power. And those people who hold the most power are the people who have usually most status power and role power. So there's a hierarchy in place that's difficult to navigate. There's not a lot of space for us to actually name our feelings. So if I, as a person who hold power, has said, I'm designing this system so that we are being very intentional about politeness and respecting, speaking in a way that's respectful, which I think usually means non-confrontational. And that is not landing right for me in my body, right? There is actually something that's happening that's violating my basic human needs and my dignity needs. In dominant culture, there's not going to be space for me to name that. If the person who holds power has explicitly said, I am communicating in a civil way, then in dominant culture, you just have to hold that because there's not going to be space for you to really name that that's not the way it's landing. There's also control over agenda. This does not mean, and I think that when people are presented with this or work with this framework a lot, there can be a weaponization around this idea of agenda. But is the agenda designed in such a way that's building relationship? Is it designed in such a way where people are included and where people are welcomed? And is it designed in such a way where diverse perspectives are prioritized? Oftentimes in dominant culture norms, there's control over agenda that's actually suppressing those things. When we're focusing on civility, there's not going to be a lot of space to actually name that there's a power structure in place that's harmful as it relates to that. In dominant culture, we have paternalistic values where those who hold the most status power and those who hold the most role power have control over decisions. So they are making, if we think about this in the lens of the workplace, they're designing strategy and tactics and delegating that down. There are notions about helping those people who have less role power or who have less status power. And there's power hoarding or power holding. So I'm only going to piece out enough information to keep productivity happening, but I'm not going to be transparent about knowledge or transparent about power because there's fear about the more transparency there is, the less power that I'll hold. There is a focus on intent over impact. So that wasn't what I intended, therefore I'm not responsible for the impact. If we're thinking about this through the lens of civility, intention is the only thing I'm responsible for. And in a society where civility is what's prioritized, it can be impolite in this culture to actually name to the person with more power that their behavior was harmful. And then there's also a tendency towards savior complex, those who have more power, seeing themselves as the people who will fix this. I alone can fix this. And then objectivity, this idea that either or thinking, you are either with me or you're against me. Well, if my ideas are different and we're operating in this dominant culture where I have to always be polite in the way that I communicate, it can be really difficult to navigate that either or thinking paradigm. Rules are always valued over actual experience, and the written word is prioritized. So I don't see that in writing. Well, where is that written? If it's not written down, it can't be true. There's only one way to do things, and this high suspicion of alternative approaches. The reality is, this is the norm that the vast majority of us are operating in. This is the norm of dominant culture in the United States, and it's mirrored in most of our workplaces. So if we're prioritizing kindness and polite communication as the thing that's going to be the glue that holds a relationship in place, what we're also doing is holding very distinct hierarchy on who gets to be the beneficiary of that politeness and that kindness. And from the language of inclusion is how you feel, if you're not feeling included, this paradigm isn't going to create a lot of space for you to name that and to explain why. So the focus on civility actually ends up benefiting those people who hold the most status and role power at the expense of people who hold less status and role power. And it leads to oppression in really specific ways. One, and this may have been surfacing for you, like you may have been beginning to really see this as I was talking about it, it can lead to gaslighting and dismissal. So when someone is raising concerns about oppression, it's labeled as incivil. You're not in civil relationship if you're naming where there's actually things happening in an organization that's causing harm to people who have less power. And therefore it gets dismissed and is not thought of as valid, and it can undermine a person's credibility, and it begins to be called unprofessional. I have a rule for myself that if I cannot find another word other than professional, I need to look where I may be holding an implicit bias. And so very often you're going to hear civility is professional behavior, and professional behavior is upholding these norms. Civility can lead to demands for politeness, asking people of color and people from historically marginalized group to be civil when discussing their experiences with racism or with inequities. And this silences their concerns, and it can prevent meaningful dialogue. In an organization where there is intentionality about rolling back any DEI efforts, it can also probably lead to actual lack of security and safety. It can lead to tone policing, where people we're focusing on the tone of someone's criticism rather than the substance of the argument can be used to discredit marginalized voices. So if we're focusing on respect and kindness and how people feel in a paradigm that's most concerned with people who hold power, then we're going to hear people highlighting inequities as people being rude. There's obvious power dynamics that can be navigated in really abusive ways. So civility, as I've made pretty abundantly clear, usually is defined by those who hold the most power, and it's used to maintain existing power structures. It ignores structural issues. Kindness and politeness are not looking at and focusing on structural realities. And we can see that explicitly in how SHRM defined equity and then plucked equity out of the body of work, and then just sort of put the whole thing to bed and started focusing on civility. And it focuses on respectability politics. Calling for people, calls for civility might be used to suppress used to pressure historically oppressed groups to conform to dominant norms. So a concern that I also have to this point is that the focus on civility is another way It is an assimilation program. It's an assimilation program named as civility. So it can really have a lot of harmful impact. Now, in an organization that's being really intentional about equity, that is really working to ensure that they have policies, practices, trainings, behavioral norms in place that are designed to eliminate the barriers to opportunities. And there's an intense focus on belonging. And that belonging would look like we have policies and practices and norms in place that are ensuring a focus that all the people inside this organization are experiencing dignity and basic human needs. Civility is a beautiful cherry on top, because on top of all of that, we're also being really intentional about being kind. And kind begins to look like connection instead of compliance. So, so my invitation is twofold. One, power structures can be in place to say, we're defunding, we're not prioritizing, and we're not going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we can still use our personal power, whatever role power we have, whatever status power we have, and all the different ways that those intersect, to be sure that in our spheres of influence, we are prioritizing people's dignity and we are ensuring that those basic human needs are met. And you can call it whatever you want. We call it a workplace culture of peace and dignity. So we can still continue to do this work in this landscape. What I also want to impart on you is that those of you who are a part of the SHRM ecosystem, I hope that you will take this recording and slides that will be shared with you and use those to educate your colleagues who haven't been spending a lot of their own professional life in deepening their understanding of equity, and so therefore aren't seeing the trap that this civility work is setting and how the long-term impact of that can actually be increased harms in our workplace. We do think it takes a lot of skill to do this work, particularly in the age of civility. And we have a lot of learning and development opportunities in our organization that support you in growing your capacity to lead with emotional intelligence and dignity intelligence, to be more compassionate, trauma-informed, conflict competent leaders. And I want to invite you to explore these opportunities. And then Scott, if you will hit the end recording button, I will also open this up for any questions that you all might have.